Next, I want to get into special forms in Berlin. Special forms look just like function invocations, or I should say when you invoke a special form that looks just like you're invoking a function. Now, we haven't covered functions yet or what their invocations look like in Berlin, but you'll see later that they look the same. But I mention it now because even though they look just like function invocations, when the transpiler encounters a special form, it does something else with them. It applies some extra logic that wouldn't apply to any other function invocations. You also can't pass special forms around like you could pass a function, but we'll get to that later. But the first two special forms I want to mention are def and let, and you use both of them for variable assignment. Now, variable assignment is simply something like this. So you would define x as being 1. And so once you've assigned this variable, x is now equal to 1. So this is very simple. Now, there are a couple of gotchas, though. The first one is def is not meant to be used for reassignment. So if you now want to change the value of x, you'd have to find a different way to do it, and I'll get into how to do that later. But you wouldn't do it using def again. So in fact, some JavaScript environments, like a Node, for example, will throw an exception if you try to do that. Now in Chrome, if I remember correctly, they used to throw an exception there as well, but they recently changed that behavior. But in any case, I actually like that they throw an exception here in Node because, like I said, def is not to be used for variable reassignments, only for variable declaration and initialization. Then we also have a special form called let. Let works in the following way. Let takes two arguments, it takes some array, and then it takes what you want to do. Now let's go into the array first. Basically what you're going to see here is pairs of symbols and values. So what we're saying here is we want a to be equal to 1 and we want b to be equal to 2. And now what we can do is we can access a and b in this part here. Now, what the let block takes as a second argument here can be simply a as a single value. And then what the entire let block will do, or let's form I should call it, it will return a. You could try the same thing with b and it'll return b and so forth. Now, there's a couple things to note, however, is a and b are only accessible now within this let form. You can't, they won't be accessible outside. Okay, so that's one thing to note. The second thing to note is something that applies to other special forms too, is that let here expects as a second argument a block, really. And a block is something that is surrounded by curly braces, and it can contain multiple lines of code. It need not only contain one line of code. However, when your code happens to, or when your block happens to only contain one line, you can omit the curlies there. That's why let knows what to do with b. Okay. If you wanted to do additional things, or you wanted to do more than one step, say, let's say you wanted to also log computing, and then you wanted to return b. That's when you would use curly braces, because you're doing multiple steps here. Now, you may think that you're going to have to use curly braces all the time. In fact, however, I think you're going to find yourself using curly braces very little, unless you use them for sets and map literals. But when it comes to blocks, I think you're going to find yourself using them very little. In fact, the core of the Berlin language has, I think, roughly 500 lines of code at the moment, at least. And I think it uses these curly braces for blocks maybe once or twice. And I would suggest trying to use them as little as possible, because if you do find yourself using a lot of block syntax curly braces, it can be an indicator, it need not be, but it can be an indicator that you're writing imperative style code. You might be mutating a lot, or you might be causing a lot of other side effects like printing something to a screen or making web requests or something, which is fine. Every now and then you have to do that. But in a functional language like Berlin, it's better to avoid causing side effects all the time. there may be a place to do it, and you may want to designate that place accordingly. But I'll get into what it means to write good Berlin code later. For now, just know that this is how def and let work, and def is used for top-level variable declarations. Those are the variables that you're going to need all throughout your file, and you can't reassign them. And let, or not straightforwardly, not using def. And let is when you want to introduce a limited block of code with its own separate scope. It closes over the rest of the outside scope, but the variables you declare within let are only going to be accessible within the scope of the block that you pass to let. So that's variable declaration and assignment for you.